Since the beginning of the refugee crisis in 2015, countries have responded in different ways to the challenge of hosting asylum seekers and refugees. In the case of Portugal, as in other countries, the government adopted a dispersed reception system which depended very much on the participation of civil society organizations to host families and individuals. The reason partly for this was, beyond not having reception centres, housing is also an issue in Portugal. It's a structural problem already for Portuguese people. And so the participation of civil society in this respect was important because the responsibility was placed upon organisations that agreed to host families to find accommodation for them. Obviously, there were funds that they received as well to pay for the accommodation if necessary, but there were also cases where institutions had accommodation that they were able to use to host families. And the article combines two research projects on this process of refugee reception, looking at integration issues, focusing specifically in rural and peri-urban areas of Portugal. The aim of the two projects was to examine the experiences of asylum seekers and refugees in these rural and peri-urban locations to try and understand how the characteristics of these receiving locations affected their subjectivities. Now, it soon became very clear to us that the characteristics of the locations they were sent to were not enough to understand the processes, because drawing on the concept of methodological nationalism, which has been used to criticize approaches in migration studies that choose the nation as a framework and are not able to see transnational relations and how these also impact upon locations. Drawing on this, we coined the term methodological ruralism, with the idea that if we were focusing on these small rural and peri-urban locations, but only looking at the characteristics of these locations, we would fail to grasp and to understand some of the reactions of the people that we were interviewing and accompanying in the research. And this was because we soon came to realize that comparison was an important part of the process, in the sense that refugees and asylum seekers who came through the European relocation program from Italy and Greece, from camps in Italy and Greece, and refugees who were resettled from Egypt and from Turkey, came with all these experiences, and they also came with lots of connections, the mobile commons, as it has been referred to in the literature. And so they would make comparisons, and these comparisons would be a constant ongoing process because of the digital communities that they were a part of. Those who arrived in Portugal, most arrived in Lisbon, and then from Lisbon they were then sent on to the different locations. Some stayed in Lisbon, others were sent to larger cities, and others were sent to these rural and peri-urban locations. And obviously they stayed in contact. If they travelled together, they already knew each other from the camps, and so comparisons were inevitable. And also because the refugee reception system depended on the participation of civil society organisations, a uniform response was therefore not possible, because this would also depend on the resources that each institution had. So some institutions that hosted refugees had more resources than others and were able to provide more. And so this set up a conflict between charity and rights, a conflict in terms of refugees not always understanding that what they were given was beyond their rights. For example, it was because the institution had these extra resources. But from the perspective of other refugees who were comparing, of course, it didn't seem to make a lot of sense to them. And so these comparisons are fundamental to understanding how refugees' experience of place was also affected. And so, although obviously it is important, and we do look in the article at the local characteristics, the practices of state agents, the role of the voluntary services, we also look at the comparisons that they make, for example, with Germany, where they say language classes took place every day for 5 days a week. In Portugal, this, for example, was not the case. But I'm probably jumping the gun here, so let's first of all talk about the methodology. So in the article, we give an account of the 2 research projects and the municipalities that we covered, which, as you can see on the PowerPoint, were various locations. We conducted up to 64 interviews across the 2 projects, and our data collection techniques were anthropological, participant observation, and semi-structured interviews. And so to return to my discussion about the results, housing shortage was probably the main factor that would determine where people were sent. If a large family arrived, a large house was needed, and therefore an organisation that could provide a large house would be contacted. So this means that people's qualifications, professional experiences, preferences could not always be taken into account, and this in itself was difficult. And then, of course, the issues of housing quality. Not all houses are prepared in northern Portugal for the cold weather, which was obviously difficult for families to live with, and electricity bills would become very high, and this would create conflicts, for example, with the hosting institutions, which during the period of the program, they would sign contracts with the government for between 24 to 18 months. They would receive funds from the government to cover these costs, but sometimes, water and electricity bills would be extremely high. Issues of housing insecurity, tenure, were also a problem. And as I was referring earlier, Portuguese language classes were compared to what was offered in Germany. In the case of Portugal, they were only available, sponsored by the state, if there were 25 students, which of course in a small location was not very likely to be the case. In Porto, in Coimbra, in Lisbon, of course. And so refugees would compare, and then the hosting institutions, to try and compensate for lack of Portuguese classes, would try to find voluntary teachers. It could be a retired Portuguese teacher, a young person willing to help, but of course they were not really qualified to teach Portuguese as a foreign language, and especially to Arabic speakers, for example, or illiterate people that didn't even know how to write in their own language. So how to help people to learn the language in that case was very difficult for them. And then, as I said, because profiles were not matched, labour integration was a problem, difficulties in recognising qualifications, and other things that you can see there on the list. And so comparisons were made between other locations in Portugal, as refugees contacted with each other through social digital networks, other countries, and this is why we have given the title multi-cited destinations with a C, because it's these multi-cited destinations which also impact upon their subjectivities, and that is why it's so important to avoid what we call methodological ruralism when analysing the specific characteristics of these small locations, especially when we look at the shortcomings, because these shortcomings were exacerbated by these comparisons that were made, because the translocal and transnational relations and their imaginings of other locations influenced their reception experience, and therefore made them feel maybe even more dissatisfied than they would have been otherwise. So this was an important aspect that we discovered in our research, which led us to choose this specific way of writing about refugees' experiences in the places that they were sent to, focusing on a combination of the local situation, the quality of the services, the more what we would call positive and negative aspects that they experience, but always through the lens of comparison. And so To conclude, what we felt was that these comparisons should somehow be capitalized in some way. You know, how can they be used to strengthen the integrative potential of their experiences of settlement in these locations?